This is Calvin Johnson. I'm sure you remember him. One of the greatest players in the history of the Detroit Lions. And in case you can't tell by this picture right here, he's one of the best wide receivers to ever step foot on an NFL field.
Help me! Help me!
But many people may have forgotten that Calvin Johnson is widely considered to be the greatest player in the history of Georgia Tech, where during his time in college, Calvin was able to eventually become one of, if not the best wide receiver in the nation, earning himself the right to be selected with the number 2 overall pick in the NFL draft. And of course, Calvin Johnson went on to go win a bunch of championships like, many of the literal greatest wide receivers to ever play the game. Of course not. Of course he did. But regardless, many people have forgotten about the legacy that Calvin Johnson left behind in order to one day become known as Megatron. So today we are putting Calvin Johnson into College Football 25. We're going to take a look back at his time in college as we follow him on his road to glory. Coming out of high school, Calvin Johnson was actually considered a 4-star recruit by some people, even though he should definitely be considered a 5-star, especially with the stats that he was putting up his senior year of high school. That boy was going crazy. But Calvin knew that it was going to be important for him to improve his skills. And since he was from the state of Georgia, he still kind of wanted to be close to home. So after taking some time to think about it, when it came to Calvin Johnson's college decision, he decided to sign with Georgia Tech. Now, when Calvin Johnson first arrived to college, the coaches knew that he could be a special talent just based on how fast he was. There were many reports saying that he was about 6'5", running a 4.3 40-yard dash. So of course, even as a freshman, Georgia Tech was getting Calvin Johnson some time on the field, and he was contributing. So much so that he eventually earned an opportunity to become the number 2 wide receiver. And it became pretty clear early on in the battle that there wasn't really much of a competition to be had, because Calvin Johnson was locked in on the field and off the field, as he was damn near an academic scholar. But now going into his sophomore season, Calvin Johnson was becoming more than just a contributor on the gridiron, because he was consistently going out there making plays in big games, especially against an in-state rival in the last game of his season, as he showed his great ability to catch the ball in traffic over the middle, and he became proficient at breaking off to the outside and becoming more of a well-rounded receiver. You see, Calvin was proving that he had potential to be one of the best weapons in the country. So by his junior season of college football, Calvin was ready to actualize that potential, because after having a couple decent years as the number 2 wide receiver, he's going into this year feeling good as the number 1, especially with the schedule that they have coming up. And the coaches seem to be pretty confident in him too, as they're asking him to go for 100 yards in the very first game. But now, as the true number 1 wide receiver, that's just the kind of performance that Calvin's going to have to put up, especially if he expects to win their first game of his junior season against Colorado. Calvin Johnson got things going with a nice little out route, and the announcers let the whole stadium know that he had just hit 1,500 career yards. Unfortunately, their opening drive of the season would end with some very bad miscommunication, the quarterback throwing the ball way behind the line of scrimmage for some reason. I don't know what that was. So Calvin Johnson comes out the field and he goes back on it down by 7. And he takes the opportunity to hit the cornerback with the corner route and bring his team all the way down to the 1-yard line, making a catch that puts his team in an excellent position to score, which his running back does in just a few plays later with a touchdown. And Georgia Tech is looking good, even with them still being down by 7 points, because with 11 seconds left in the half, Calvin Johnson was able to break past this corner and made the catch over the top for a long gain. He was looking to take it all the way for the first score of his junior season, coming up with a touchdown to tie the game up, and once again, things were looking good. But things would change in the second half as they found themselves down by 7, and the quarterback was throwing an interception that was taken all the way back to the crib for 6, giving Colorado the 2-possession lead and putting Georgia Tech in a little bit of a bind. So Calvin Johnson knew that he was going to have to be the one to make a play, and with less than 2 minutes left to play, Calvin Johnson went down the field and snagged this ball out the air, coming up with an incredible catch to bring his team inside the 10-yard line and in excellent position to score. Where on this third down, all they got to do is get the ball in the end zone, but they throw a pick. And Calvin Johnson is about to lose his first game of the season. Gee, I hope that's a representation of what's going to happen in his pro career. I mean, that'd be crazy. Georgia Tech loses their first game 28-14, with Calvin Johnson putting on a monstrous performance with almost 300 yards. But because they lost, his coach didn't really seem to care, even though he damn near tripled his game day challenge. So now going on the road in their second game of the season, Georgia Tech was looking to pick up a dub against an in-state rival, as they were set to face off against Georgia State. Now, this Georgia Tech offense was moving the ball well even without Calvin Johnson, as they methodically marched right down towards the goal line and were able to punch it in for a touchdown to take the 7-0 lead. Now, early on, Calvin Johnson was definitely having his fair share of struggles, but he would eventually pick it up as he was able to snag this ball off the defender's dome piece. And with less than 40 seconds left before half, this same defender was looking like he should be going to Georgia State University of the Handicapped and Paralyzed, because that boy wasn't guarding nothing. Before he knew it, Calvin Johnson was running right by him for his second touchdown of the season and extending their lead to 2 possessions. But it would only get worse because even with this cornerback having inside leverage, Calvin Johnson was not only able to stack over the top, but he would make a catch before going across the field all the way towards the end zone for a touchdown, building a pretty large lead for Georgia State. But Calvin Johnson didn't seem to want to take his foot off the gas, because he came out on the next drive running a post over the middle, and he split the safeties, eventually running past the entire defense, coming up with a catch and run that led to his 3rd touchdown of the game, and a score that would ultimately go on to give Georgia Tech their first win of the season, as they go on to finish the job 34-14. And Calvin Johnson has another incredible stat line, almost getting another 300 yards. He did get the 3 touchdowns though, earning himself the ACC Player of the Week. Somehow though, after back-to-back incredible weeks, he hadn't won any nationals. It was all good though, because Calvin Johnson was more focused on winning, and this week, he got it done. But he was going to have to get it done again this week against another ACC opponent, as Georgia Tech was set to face off against Wake Forest. Now, Calvin Johnson went into this game knowing that he would have to make some difficult catches to get his team going, and oftentimes the quarterback just trusted to throw the ball up to Calvin Johnson and see what he can do. And there were definitely times where that did not end too well, as in this game the quarterback got picked off multiple times when throwing Calvin Johnson's way. But it turns out that throwing to wide open wide receivers down the sideline also works, as Georgia Tech was able to get in for a score to tie this game up at 10. And with under a minute left in this game, Calvin Johnson knew that down by 3, he was going to have to make a play. The good news is that Calvin Johnson had gained leverage over the initial cornerback, but now he was going to have to go up and fight for the ball against the safety, and somehow Calvin Johnson actually makes the catch, coming up with a huge play off the tip pass that turned into a touchdown to win this game, as Georgia Tech goes on to finish this job 17-13. And shout out to Calvin Johnson with 150 yards through the air and 1 game-winning touchdown. And at this point, Calvin was proving himself to be a big threat down the field, especially considering that he was leading the country in receiving yards. But the scary thing is that Calvin Johnson was really working hard to be better. So going into another home game, there were many people that believed that Calvin Johnson would continue his domination and potentially help lead Georgia Tech to victory against Eastern Michigan. Now, to start this game off, Calvin Johnson and his quarterback decided to take a shot deep. The ball hung up in the air for a little bit before Calvin Johnson snagged it out the sky, setting his team up with excellent field position, but they would eventually get stopped on 4th down. And it wasn't getting much easier in the red zone yet, with this quarterback throwing interceptions across the field. This offense wouldn't really start getting things going until Calvin Johnson worked his way around the safety and got open in the back of the end zone for the first points of this ball game. And luckily, Eastern Michigan didn't seem to have any plans of scoring this game. So later on, when Calvin Johnson was able to break over the top for another catch and bring his team all the way upfield down towards the 1-yard line, all it was going to take was a little hey from Calvin Johnson to get himself in the end zone for another touchdown and ultimately put this game away, as Georgia Tech goes on to win this game 17-0. And Calvin Johnson comes up big in the shutout, going for over 180 yards and 2 touchdowns, earning himself another ACC Offensive Player of the Week, but he felt like he should be earning nationals, so he kept working, improving on many of his skills before heading into a big-time matchup against another ACC opponent, with Georgia Tech set to face off against Louisville. Very early on in this game, this offense showed signs of struggle because this quarterback would go on to throw not just 1, but 2 picks that went all the way back to the crib for 6. And still within the first quarter, Calvin Johnson is witnessing his quarterback throw his 3rd pick of the game, putting Georgia Tech in a really bad spot. But gee, I hope this isn't a representation of what's going to happen in Calvin Johnson's pro career, right? Come on. Eventually, though, this Georgia Tech offense would be able to get down to the goal line. And it was looking good up until this cornerback swatted this ball to Zimbabwe. I mean, are y'all seeing this or am I tripping? Is this not the strongest backhand y'all ever seen? This guy could be the world's greatest pimp. And it might even be a better career path for him after Calvin Johnson cooks him on this out route and gets open for his first touchdown of the game, putting some points on the board and hoping to give his team some life. But by the end of the 4th quarter, Georgia Tech was still down by 3 possessions. And after this incompletion on 4th down, Georgia Tech would go on to lose another game, getting blown out 28-10, and Calvin Johnson can't really say that any of it's his fault. He had another 150-plus yard performance, and that's even with him staying locked in the classroom. But going back on the road now, Calvin knows that he has to step his game up, because one more loss from his team could mean that they would be ineligible for a major bowl game. So he went into his next game looking to possibly have his best one against Virginia Tech. Now, on one of the first plays of the game, this offense decided to take a shot deep to Calvin Johnson, and he went right on downfield and said, "Wang," making a catch and breaking free for a touchdown to get this game started. And it feels like the momentum was about to keep them going. But throughout the game, there'd be a little bit of miscommunication, and this quarterback was back to throwing picks. So not necessarily the position you want to be in, but things are a lot easier when you have a guy like Calvin Johnson to just go up and snag this ball out the air, even though he's being covered by two defenders. And then on this third down and goal, Calvin went out there and hit the cornerback with an out route and got in for the score to make it now a one-possession game. But with Virginia Tech playing well on offense, Calvin Johnson knows that he's going to have to play well too. So he breaks free wide open over the top, finding himself streaking down the sideline for another touchdown that would give Georgia the opportunity to tie this game up and eventually send it into overtime, where of course when given the opportunity, Calvin Johnson would go out there and make an incredible play. Blurred all over that boy's head top, no pause, I don't care. Because Calvin Johnson had given his team the lead, but Virginia Tech would just go down the field and tie it up, sending it to another overtime, where after Georgia Tech fails this two-point conversion, they would unfortunately go on to lose another game, 37-39. But despite the loss, Calvin Johnson did have his best performance of the season, and 258 yards with 5 touchdowns would be more than enough to earn him National Offensive Player of the Week. His first one of the year, but he was pretty surprised when he saw that there were 2 wide receivers above him in the Heisman race. But you know what, it was all good though, because Calvin was always prepared to continue working, and he knew he'd have to if he wanted to prevent another loss. So he went into his next game against Stanford looking to get his team back on track. And throughout this game, Calvin Johnson was making plays all over the place, catching receptions up and down the field before crossing over the goal line for his first touchdown of the game. He had done a lot of moving the chains for his team in this game, especially in the second half, because he was making catches to keep their drive going and at least get them into field goal range. And even though they would end up getting stopped on third down, a pair of field goals would be enough to eventually put this game away, as Georgia Tech would go on to win 19-14. And Calvin Johnson's 10 receptions for 196 yards were definitely a contributing factor. But with Georgia Tech now going into the back half of their season, Calvin Johnson knows that with this potentially being his last year in college football, he's going to have to continue on this pace and potentially even break a record that another Calvin Johnson set 20 years earlier. So going into his next game against a ranked opponent, Calvin knew that this was an excellent opportunity to get his team back in the top 25 with a W. Unfortunately though, it was looking real bleak for this offense throughout the first half. Failed third down conversion, and then Calvin Johnson actually comes out here and makes a catch. But I don't know what the refs are seeing, because the ground clearly causes a fumble here. So Calvin definitely got cheated a little bit, but he ended up getting his revenge, because he would break free over the top over 2 defenders and catch this ball in the end zone for a touchdown, coming up with the score to bring it back to a 1-possession deficit. And by the second half, Calvin was continuing to do his part in trying to get his team in great position to get a lead, crossing over the goal line for another score to keep it at 1 possession. But by the fourth quarter, Pittsburgh had gone up by multiple possessions and they were starting to dominate. And I don't know what Calvin Johnson was doing right here to cause this pick, but it didn't really matter because they would still go on to lose 14-31. It's kind of crazy to think that Calvin Johnson could have all these great games and his team could still lose. Gee, I hope this isn't a representation of what's going to happen in Calvin Johnson's NFL career. Nah, I'm sure that won't happen, because there's always going to be times like this next big game against Clemson where Calvin Johnson would come in ready to put the team on his back if he has to, especially if it means that they could come away with a victory. Now to start this game off, there is some major miscommunication between this quarterback and Calvin Johnson, as he goes on to throw a pick that goes back for 6 on this opening possession. But Calvin knew that if they play like this against a top-ranked team like Clemson, then they'll fall behind early. So he makes an incredible catch downfield to give his team some life, and even though that drive would end in 3 points, Calvin was looking to make sure that this next drive wouldn't, because he makes the catch up the seam and is able to break free from the remaining defenders and find himself eventually crossing over the goal line for a touchdown, making it a 1-possession game. But it looks like Clemson was about to take complete control as they go on to force a turnover, but luckily they were actually called for a flag, which gives an opportunity for Calvin Johnson to just zoom by his defender right here and catch this ball over the top for another touchdown to tie this game up right before half. But this kind of stuff wouldn't stop going into the third quarter because Calvin Johnson was absolutely cooking these boys up, getting open again for another catch and run that eventually went across the goal line, scoring a touchdown that this time would take the lead. And now later on in the fourth quarter, Calvin Johnson was taking the opportunity to go in for another score to put this game away, as Georgia Tech would go on to beat the best team in the conference 31-23. All thanks to another immaculate performance from Calvin Johnson, who just so happened to earn himself another National Offensive Player of the Week. But Calvin knew that with this season now nearing to a close, he could finish out his college career with a string of victories if they continued to play at this level. But to start this game off, this Georgia Tech quarterback is playing at probably the worst level you possibly can, throwing not just an interception on their own end, but throwing an interception once again in the red zone, taking some points off the board that, if it weren't for Calvin Johnson, who was able to break free over the top for a big gain and was able to streak his way down the sideline for a touchdown in the fourth quarter, then this game might already be out of reach. But luckily this game there was actually a receiver on the opposite side who was coming up clutch this time, as the wide receiver 2 was able to cross over the goal line for another touchdown, but Duke was still able to come away with the victory, winning 17-14 in a game that Calvin Johnson barely even had any receptions but still had over 100 yards. And he felt good about the fact that he was now getting a little bit of consideration from the Heisman voters. It still makes him a little bit angry though, because even though he's clearly the best wide receiver in the country, there is actually another wide receiver leading the vote. So that's something. Regardless, Georgia Tech has another opportunity to come away with a victory, as they're set to face off against an unranked Boston College. Unfortunately though, just like many games that Calvin Johnson had dealt with before, his quarterback is throwing some Stevie Wonder balls, turning the ball over early but then somehow being able to turn right around and find Calvin Johnson wide open over the top, delivering a ball that would hang up in the air for a bit before eventually being caught. And Calvin Johnson would cross over the goal line for a touchdown to take the lead. But it wasn't just Calvin Johnson making plays, because his wide receivers would come up big, and lately they were also making plays to get their team across the goal line. This one allows Georgia to take the lead back, but it becomes clear that Boston College is not messing around. And after there's some more miscommunication about the placement of this throw, resulting in another turnover, and it's looking like Boston College is about to put this game away, with Georgia Tech losing another close one 21-24. In yet another game where, despite Calvin Johnson's excellent performance, his team would go on to lose. Gee, I hope this isn't a representation of what's going to happen in his NFL career. It really is too bad though, man, because Calvin Johnson's out here doing everything he can. He's doing all the right things, and yet it's looking like his team might not even be in a spot for a bowl game. So now going into their last game of the regular season, Calvin Johnson's hoping that he can lead his team on the road against one of the top teams in the country, and potentially come up with the upset to give his team some postseason life. Now, it shouldn't surprise you to find out that this quarterback actually started out with an interception, turning the ball over, and now just like that, this Georgia Tech team was down by 10 points in the second quarter. Calvin Johnson was definitely looking to change that though, as he got himself wide open over the top, eventually making the catch, and he was streaking upfield for what he believes is a wide open touchdown. But this number 1 dude is fast as hell, because he actually catches up to him and stops him at the 1 yard line. But it was all good though, because a few plays later, the running back crossed over the goal line for a touchdown to make it a 3-point deficit. And now right before half, they had a chance to put up some more points, but the quarterback just threw another pick instead. So now after halftime, it wasn't necessarily looking great, but Calvin Johnson was doing his best. But sometimes that's all you need when you have a guy who could say "skrrr" and get himself wide open for a touchdown against one of the top teams in the land. But with this game now coming down to the wire with under 2 minutes left, Calvin Johnson had another opportunity to come up with a big play. As soon as the ball was snapped, he beat his defender off the line of scrimmage. And just like that, he was wide open deep. Nobody there to cover him over the top before he was eventually dragged across the goal line for a touchdown, giving Georgia Tech the lead and control of this game, especially after Georgia fails to score on offense. And even though Georgia Tech would fail to convert on third down with under a minute left, they had still done enough to put this game away, as they go on to upset top-ranked Georgia by 1 point. Of course, led by Calvin Johnson, who closed out his regular season with another 150-plus yard performance, plus the game-winning touchdown that got them the victory. But now that the regular season is over and Georgia Tech won't be playing in any conference championships, it's time for some awards to be given out. And it turns out that wide receiver Thomas Zeros wins the Heisman Trophy. Yet Calvin Johnson, wide receiver, wins best wide receiver. So what the fuck is going on here? Like how? Calvin Johnson damn near doubles this dude in yards and leads him in almost every single other stat. I mean, I don't know if this dude had somebody suck off all the Heisman voters on his behalf, because this shit right here makes negative sense. Like, there's really not even a way to rationalize it, but gee, I'm sure this won't be a representation of what's going to happen in his pro career. He'll never get robbed like this. I'm sure he'll at least be in second place. But regardless, the best part about all of this is that Georgia Tech would still be able to play one more game, as they had the upcoming Arizona Bowl against Wake Forest. So Calvin knew going into potentially his final game of his college football career, he was going to do his best to leave it all out in the field and come away with a bowl game victory. And this was a game where it seemed like Calvin Johnson was doing a little more than leaving it on the field, because he was leaving the bodies of Wake Forest on the field too, on his way to the end zone for a score in the first half, giving Georgia Tech the early 7-0 lead. But apparently Calvin Johnson isn't done yet, because he goes up and says, "Mwang," snacks his ball out the air, and comes up with the incredible catch deep inside opposing territory. But nah, you see, Calvin wasn't done there, because he actually reads the cover 2 on this play, and he's able to get himself open down the sideline before making the catch, and there is now nobody over the top from stopping him from gliding his way in the end zone for another touchdown, giving Georgia Tech the 2-possession lead going into the second half. And it just seems like Calvin Johnson is showing no signs of stopping, as he is absolutely destroying DBs in this game, breaking off another tackle on his way to the end zone for another score. Definitely playing this game like it's his last, man, but I don't blame him. Crazy thing is that a lot of these touchdown plays would pale in comparison to this one, because after Calvin Johnson breaks back towards the outside, he would go on to smack the absolute shit out of everybody in his way. He didn't even go down, man. He goes out of bounds on his own. It seems like he must know that this is his final game of his career, and he's about to go out on a very unselfish note, as he helped spring this running back loose, and he went across the goal line for a touchdown to put this final game of the season away, with Georgia Tech going on to win this one 35-24. All thanks to easily his most dominant performance of the season, over 300 yards receiving and 3 touchdowns from Calvin Johnson. But now that Georgia Tech has won the Arizona Bowl, Calvin Johnson's season is over, and reporters are asking him how he feels about all them yards he got.
What does that mean to you?
It's ridiculous. Thank God. That's all I can say, man. Thank God, man.
Calvin Johnson went on to do just as well, if not better, than another receiver of the same name in the same Georgia Tech record books. And after an incredible career and season, where Calvin Johnson dominated just about every single game that he played in all year, he had finally come to his decision and decided that it was time for him to move on from college and enter his name into the NFL draft, sending him on the path to become Megatron, as we all know him to be today. But this was Calvin Johnson's college career in College Football 25. And if you want to see me put more players like Calvin in College Football 25, get this video to 1,000 likes and subscribe to the channel down below. But don't forget to also comment down below who else you guys want to see next. And be sure to check out some of these other videos until the next one comes out. If you got to this point in the video, just know that I appreciate you more than you'll ever know. I hope all of your college football and NFL teams make some excellent moves this offseason. And other than that, I'm going to catch you guys next time.